Now, the regulatory challenges remain the biggest stumbling blocks to the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises in the country. That was echoed at the Ignite SME Summit underway in Johannesburg. Speakers talked about the low levels of entrepreneurship programs and the unnecessary regulation that small business is being subjected to. SABC News' senior economics reporter and SME On Point anchor Diabo Seto is attending that summit. Good afternoon to you, Diabo. So the plight of SMMEs being discussed, the challenges, is there hope as well?
Look, Francis, there definitely is hope. However, a lot of work still needs to be done. A lot has been said about the contribution of small and medium enterprises to the mainstream economy, to job creation, and just to general livelihood. However, we know of the challenges that small and medium enterprises face. A lot of people talk about access to finance, access to market, but what about regulatory environment? Is there over-regulation? Should small businesses be subjected to tax and other things? These are some of the things that came out this morning at this Ignite SME Summit. The person that talked mostly about the impact of the regulatory environment on the entrepreneurship landscape was Mr. Mark Frankel, who is the CEO of SA Black Umbrellas. He is with me, SA Black Umbrellas, and he's going to tell us more about his thoughts about over-regulation and what that does to small business development. Does it throttle it, or do we need some level of regulation? Mr. Frankel, thank you so much for speaking to us here at the SABC News channel. You had a lot to say about regulation and over-regulation of small and medium enterprises. Just how much damage does it do? And is it necessarily a bad thing to have the small business sector that is regulated?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think the important thing is to have regulation which is appropriate to the stage of the business, because regulation and compliance is important at the right stage of the business. So, for example, to be able to get into corporate supply chains, etc., there's a lot of regulation and compliance, that comes around that. You need to have your tax affairs in order, latest financial statements, etc., etc. But when you're looking at emerging business, which is quite a challenging space that we find in South Africa, is to be able to get new businesses off the ground, particularly by those entrepreneurs who have the potential to create sustainable businesses. It is a very challenging environment for them. So there is probably a lot of regulation at that very early stage, which makes it difficult for the entrepreneur. So they're spending far too much time on complying with the regulation rather than focusing on their business.
Yeah. We saw much of this phenomenon during the COVID-19 pandemic, where government was issuing out relief funds, and many of businesses could not be able to get those relief funds simply because they did not have their affairs and paperwork in order. And once again, that conversation came up about, is it even necessary to be needing so much? And this led to only about 4 or 5% of small business owners getting relief from government. Do you know of any innovative ways in which we can still get small business owners and entrepreneurs to have the necessary paperwork, but one that does not tie them to desks and running from one department to another?
So I think it really depends on the type of finance that you're looking at there. So if you're looking at loan funding, it is challenging because you have the FICA regulations, etc., that need to be complied with. And we've had additional pressure within South Africa around FATF. So there is compliance that needs to happen there. But when it comes to grant funding, it's a different scenario. You don't have those same compliance regulations. And another area that is being looked at to a large extent is around data. So how do we look at the data around the transactions of the entrepreneur to determine their creditworthiness, etc., and base it on that, purely on the paperwork and the compliance?
There was another interesting point that came out of your panel discussion this morning about whether the acronyms SME should be standing for small, medium enterprises or small and micro enterprises, and whether medium businesses really should be falling under SME bandit. What is your thought with that?
It's a difficult area because everybody has a different definition as to what a small business is, what a medium businesses. Mention was also made, if you look at the BE codes, you've got QSEs, EMEs, etc. And the limit for a QSE is 50 million, but that was set 10 years ago. So, and I mean, obviously with inflation, et cetera, should that change? So I think the major thing is to look rather at small and growing businesses, to a certain extent. And it's also a case of different support for different stages of businesses, similar to the regulatory environment. So I think medium businesses are still important because they are the large job creators. Every small business aspires to grow to be a medium business. So there does need to be the proper support mechanisms at the level as well, because we want to sustain those businesses. The big challenge in South Africa is creating sustainable businesses. So we need to have the support mechanism in place to make sure that happens, because obviously as the businesses grow to be larger, they grow the smaller businesses around them, which is key.
Another number that was bandied about in there was the 9%. I think it had to do with the level of entrepreneurship in the country is 9%. It's not even double digit. If that is so, it's quite low. How do we even try to make it, to at least elevate it to a double digit? We would one day want to see ourselves at around 50%. However, it's not to be with when you look at the economic challenges, when you look at the fact that many businesses had to close down, and the regulatory environment as well. What can you do with this 9%?
Sure, it's quite a complex area and there's a lot of different interventions, but I think it really is a combination of the development of the entrepreneur around their skills and ability. Because firstly, it's got to be the right person. Not everybody's cut out to be an entrepreneur. So how do we identify those who have what it takes to be able to create sustainable businesses? And then how do we put the right support mechanisms in place? And something that everybody talks about, obviously, is funding, because that funding has to be there at that stage. And there is a significant lack of risk capital at that early stage to support those growing businesses. And another factor that we face in South Africa is a high fear of failure. So how do we remove that fear of failure? And that's largely through imparting knowledge, because that removes the fear.
Mr. Frankel, thank you so much for making time to speak to us. I've been speaking, Francis, to Mr. Mark Frankel. He is the CEO of Black Umbrellas, and he gives us his views about what can be done to elevate that number of 9% of entrepreneurship levels in the country, which is quite disappointing when you think of how much conversations are being had around people needing to move into entrepreneurship. But he also makes a very important point that not everyone is cut out to be an entrepreneur. We also spoke a little earlier to someone who talked about accidental entrepreneurship and how that may be contributing to low and failure of businesses, particularly in South Africa. In the next hour, Francis, I'm going to be speaking to two entrepreneurs to find out and hear from them what their challenges are, where the opportunities are in their different fields of business. And with that, I'll hand over back to you in studio.
Thank you very much, Diabo. And it's a good point. Some people actually don't have the passion for entrepreneurship. They would love to be in an organization, but then they have to do it simply as a means to survive.